Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great privilege to introduce and invite Dr. Diamond to the stage to tell us all about the world until yesterday. Let's give him a wonderful Philadelphia welcome. And notice he has a red coat for the Red Sox.
Let me first check whether you'll be able to hear me okay in back. Can you hear in back? It's a great pleasure to be back in Philadelphia today and to be back in this wonderful library to talk about subjects other than gallbladders. Instead, to give me an idea how many of you here this evening may find what I'm about to tell you of practical value, I'd like to ask you to raise your hands to one or the other of two questions that I'll now pose. First, could those of you raise your hand who either are over age 65 or hope to live past age 65 or have a parent or grandparent over 65? Many of you, all right. Then the second group, let me ask, please raise your hand if you are under 65, have no intention of living past 65, and have no parent or grandparent who passed 65. Raise your hand. All right, we have a smattering. Those of you who in the first group, you're the ones to whom I think my talk this evening will be of practical value. Those of you who in the second group, my talk will not be of practical value, but I think you'll still find this subject fascinating. I'm going to talk about growing older in traditional societies. This subject is just one chapter of my latest book, which compares traditional small societies with our big modern societies with respect to many aspects of society, such as growing old, bringing up children, health, dealing with danger, settling disputes, war, religion, and speaking more than one language. This book is my most personal book, my book of, I think, the most practical value to our daily lives. And as a shameless author, I hope it's going to be my best-selling book. It's about what I've learned from spending a lot of my time in traditional tribal societies in New Guinea over the last 50 years. And it's about what friends and other scholars have learned from other tribal societies around the world. All of us here this evening are accustomed to living in big industrial societies, in permanent housing, with central governments to make decisions, with writing and books and the internet, where most people live past age 60, where we regularly encounter strangers, just as I'm encountering you this evening, and where most of us eat food grown by older people. We forget that every one of those things arose very recently in human history. Humans have constituted a separate line of biological evolution for about 6 million years. But all of the things that I just mentioned didn't exist anywhere in the world 11,000 years ago. They arose only within the last 11,000 years, and some of them, such as the internet and the phenomenon of most people living past age 60, arose only within the last century or two. That is, the ancestors of all of us here were living under traditional tribal conditions until virtually yesterday, measured on that 6 million year time scale of human evolution. Until Europeans started to expand around the world 500 years ago, tribal societies still occupied large parts of all of the continents. But tribal societies have recently been coming under the control of modern societies with state governments, to the point where today the last tribal societies not yet under state control are confined to just small areas of New Guinea and the Amazon basin. Those tribal societies, which constituted all human societies for most of human history, are far more diverse than are our modern big societies. All big societies that have governments and where most people are strangers to each other are similar to each other and different from tribal societies in many basic ways, regardless of whether our big societies are American, German, Chinese, Israeli, or whatever. Tribes constitute thousands of natural experiments in how to run a human society. They constitute experiments from which we ourselves may be able to learn. For example, Today, if you think that modern American children enjoy too much freedom, or else if you think that modern American children aren't given enough freedom, you cannot perform the decisive experiment of designating 17 American states where kids have to remain strictly subservient to their parents and grandparents, 17 other states where babies will be given the freedom to make their decisions and to play with sharp knives from the age of 2 onwards, and 16 other states where children continue to be treated as they're treated today. If we could only carry out that controlled experiment, we could come back in 40 years, compare the children from all those states, and quickly settle the question whether it's better to raise kids with more freedom, less freedom, or the same freedom that they enjoy today. Unfortunately, it's impossible to carry out that decisive experiment in the US, but there are thousands of traditional societies in which children already did grow up with either much more freedom or much less freedom than in the modern US. By examining what actually does or did happen in traditional societies that are much more varied than modern American society, we may be able to learn things of practical value to us in deciding how to raise our kids, how to treat our older people, how to remain healthy, and other things that we care a lot about. Tribal societies shouldn't be scorned as primitive and miserable, but also they shouldn't be idealized as happy and peaceful. When we learn of tribal practices, some of them will horrify us, but there are other tribal practices which, when we hear about them, we may admire and envy them and wonder whether we could adopt those practices ourselves. To get some perspective on how we treat elderly people in Western modern societies, let me tell you the opinion of a friend of mine from the Fiji Islands in the Pacific who had visited the United States. There were some things that my friend admired about the US, other things that he disliked about the US, but what he most loathed about the US was our treatment of older people. He almost shouted at me indignantly, "You Americans throw away your older people." Those were his words. By that he meant that most old people in the US end up living separately from their children and separately from most of their friends of their earlier years, and often live in separate retirement homes for the elderly. In Fiji and other traditional societies, older people instead live out their lives among their children, their other relatives, and their lifelong friends. Nevertheless, the treatment of the elderly varies enormously among traditional societies, from much worse to much better than in our modern societies. At the worst extreme, many traditional societies get rid of their elderly in one of 5 increasingly direct ways. The most indirect method to get rid of the elderly is just to neglect them and not to feed them or clean them until they die. The second method is to abandon them when the group moves on. The third method is to encourage older people to commit suicide. A fourth, more direct method is to kill older people with their own cooperation. For example, among the Kowloon people of Papua New Guinea, a widow whose husband has just died asks her brothers or sons to come strangle her. The fifth and most direct method to get rid of the elderly is to kill them without their consent or cooperation. In what tribal societies do children abandon or kill their parents? It happens mainly under 2 conditions. One is in nomadic, hunter-gatherer societies that often shift camp and that are physically incapable of transporting old people who can't walk when the able-bodied younger people already have to carry their young children and their physical possessions. The other condition for getting rid of older people is in societies living in marginal or fluctuating environments, such as the Arctic or deserts, where there are periodic food shortages, and occasionally there just isn't enough food to keep everyone alive. Whatever food is available has to be reserved for able-bodied people still capable of contributing to the tribe's survival, and for the children who will grow up to be the tribe's future adults. Can you still hear okay? Yes. Okay, good. To us modern Americans, it sounds horrible to think of abandoning or killing your own sick spouse or your own elderly parent. But what else could those societies do? They face a cruel choice. Their old people had to do it with their own parents, and the old people know what now is going to happen to them. For any of you who are never